Welcome everyone to this book talk. My name is Moska. I'm the archivist for the Muslims in Canada archive, and today I'll be hosting the wonderful author of Minarets on the Horizon, Muslim Pioneers in Canada, Dr. Murray Hogben. We thank him for joining us. I'm going to start off first with a land acknowledgement. This land acknowledgement is specific to where I live and work, as well as where the University of Toronto situates. Today is Toronto, Ontario, Canada. But I encourage you all to reflect on the Indigenous lands you are joining us virtually from today. I'd like to acknowledge the sacred land on which the U of T operates. Toronto has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee peoples, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The treaties that were signed for this particular parcel of land are collectively referred to as the Williams Treaties of 1923. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. So, this event is hosted by the Muslims in Canada Archive, MiCA for short, where I'm the archivist. MiCA is a collaborative and participatory archive at the Institute of Islamic Studies, and provides a platform for the missing Muslim voices in Canada. The IIS at the University of Toronto offers a unique multi-perspective view of Canadian society through the advanced study of Islam and Muslims. The Institute of Islamic Studies brings together academics from across disciplines to collaborate on research projects that fill critical gaps in our understanding of Islam and Muslims in Canada and beyond. The projects study and respond to issues across social, political, academic, and cultural sectors. Professor Amber Iman, the director of the IIS, was not able to join us today, but extends his well wishes. All right, so in terms of an agenda for this event, first I'm going to introduce Dr. Murray Hogben again, the book. Following that, we'll hear from the wonderful publisher of the book, Nur Jahan Aziz of Moenzi House, and then Murray and I will have a discussion. I have some questions for him. He'll choose some snippets to read from the book, as well as give brief summaries of some of the stories and the people in it. Following all of that, we'll have a short Q&A where you may ask any questions that you may have, and we'll hopefully, fingers crossed, adjourn at exactly 4:30. Okay, I'll get started. I want to thank you all again for joining us today. As Murray and I discuss his book, Minarets on the Horizon. I especially want to thank you, Murray, for joining us. I'm just going to read your biography really quickly. So Murray Hogben was born in Toronto in 1935 and grew up in Ottawa. In 1957, he earned a bachelor's degree in English literature and then a journalism degree at Carleton University. There he met an Indian Muslim student, Alia Rauf, and I'm sorry if I didn't say her surname correctly, where Alia Rauf duly became a Muslim in 1956 and they married in 1959. Working for the CBC in Toronto, he became secretary in 1960 of the New Muslim Society of Toronto for years. Also starting in 1965, he began to earn a doctorate in history from the University of Toronto, graduating in 1973. He then taught at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, and then at Le Collège Militaire Royal de Saint-Jean, I'm very sorry if my French was bad, in Quebec. Murray then joined, meanwhile, he had also become secretary of the Islamic Society of Kingston, a volunteer Muslim chaplain at several prisons, secretary of the Kingston Police Race Relations Advisory Committee, and for decades, canoeing instructor and arts and crafts director at a camp for Muslim girls and boys. Murray and Alia live on their hobby farm near Kingston, close to their children and grandchildren. Welcome, Murray, and thank you for joining us. Right. And in case some of you haven't read the book yet, let me just read this synopsis for y'all. It's also on the screen as well. This book gives us a detailed look at the Muslim presence in Canada, starting with the pioneer settlers from Syria, Lebanon, and the Balkans in the early 20th century, and moving on to the more modern mid-century arrivals from South Asia and Africa. Told in their own words, the stories in this collection give us a rare insight into the lives of these pioneer Muslims, Punjabi men in the timber mills of British Columbia, Lebanese Arab peddlers on foot or horse cart on rural highways of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, men venturing north on dog sleighs to trade for fur, young women arriving to start families and soon to become family matriarchs, shopkeepers serving small provincial towns and big cities, and finally, students and professionals arriving in the post-war urban centers. Wherever they went, they bore the brunt of xenophobia and acknowledged kindness as they adapted and sought out fellow worshippers and set up community centers and mosques. A Muslim identity was retained, adapted, and diversified. And speaking of the book, no book would exist without the hard work and dedication of its publisher. I'd like to call on Nurjahan Aziz to say a few words about Moenzi House.
Thank you, Moska. It's a real pleasure to be here talking about, taking part in the discussion on the book. So I'm Nurjahan Aziz, publisher at Moenzi House. We publish literary titles and memoirs with a focus on works by Canadians who trace their roots and cultures to non-European traditions, specifically African, Asian, Caribbean, and Middle Eastern. We have run the company for 40 years. We are very proud to have published Murray Hogben's History of the Muslim Pioneers in Canada. When we received his manuscript, we immediately saw its value. No such historical survey of the Muslim presence in Canada existed. This has been a labor of love for Murray, interviewing the survivors or descendants of all the early pioneers from the 1970s on to record this piece of history. It's a book all Canadians should read. Murray has done the Canadian Muslim community a great service. Thank you.
Thank you, Nurjahan. With that, I'm okay to start with the discussion. We are actually earlier than I thought. So let's start. So again, just to reiterate, Murray and I will be talking about the book now. I have a couple of questions for him. And following that, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A where folks can ask any questions that they have. We'll go from there. So I will stop sharing my screen now so that, okay, great. And this is when I will spotlight you, Murray, and let me know if you can see me or not.
Yes, I can now.
Okay. Sorry, one moment. I'm just see if I can. Ooh. Ah, there we go. Is that you can you still see me?
I can still see you. Who's this old man on the screen, though?
All right. So to start off, okay, let's just start off. I have a very important question that we can start off with, and that's related to the title of your book. What did you mean by pioneer Muslims? Could you clarify what that means for you and your definition of it?
Yeah, well, when you think of pioneers, I mean, in North America, school books and so on, think of people in covered wagons or people, cutting down forests and so on, that kind of tradition. But when you think of, or when you begin to find out the experience of Canadian pioneer Muslims, coming from the late 19th century on. I had to, as I developed this thing, I've found that in 1967, as a result of finalizing several immigration law changes in the 1960s, they finally kind of deracialized the immigration laws, which had basically restricted, until, what was it, 1951, there were about, 1,800 Muslims or something in Canada, because they had been always restricted because of their race or where they came from. But finally, with the kind of liberation of the world in the 1960s, the late 1960s, then they said, okay, we're going to bring in a point system. It's no longer where you come from and what color of skin you have and what weird religion you have, but what you can do for the country. And so that 1967 is my kind of cutoff date, because after that, the immigration figures start shooting up. I mean, they really rise up on and on and on to where we are now, where Muslims are everywhere in the country.
Okay, so the pioneers, to clarify, are folks that came before the 1967, your cutoff date there. Okay. Yeah. So my next question for you is, what motivated you to collect the stories, these stories back in 1979? I know you do mention at some point, I forgot to show the book. Actually, this is my copy of the book for those of you wondering how, and yeah, I did take a lot of notes. But my question is, what motivated you to collect these stories in 1979 and then write the book in 2021, actually?
Well, all right. In the 1970s, I was a struggling academic. I'd managed to get this degree in 73 and was doing various things, but I was also involved with a thing called the Council of Muslim Communities of Canada. And in the late 1970s, McClelland and Stewart and other publishers were producing all sorts of books. before Moenzi, on the history of the Greeks in Canada and the Poles in Canada and the Lithuanians in Canada, and including Professor Abu Laban's an olive branch on the family tree, the Arabs in Canada. So, but the Muslims were this kind of lateral thing as opposed to being an ethnic silo, in effect.
Right.
And we thought it would be interesting. So Muinuddin, who was the secretary, manager, ideas man, said maybe we should try that. And as an academic and as a keen Muslim, it sounded like a really good idea. So that's why we started getting a small grant to do some of the initial legwork across the country.
So the grant, the project itself was came out of the Canadian Council of Muslim Communities.
Yep.
So it wasn't just you alone then.
No.
Okay. But you were doing the interviews. So.
I was the man to do it. Yeah.
Okay. So on that note, actually, you do mention in the beginning of the book that you did lack a lot of support from your institutions, institutional support when it came to this. Could you go into that a little bit more?
Well, yeah, really, I had this small budget of, a few $1,000s, I forget what it was, to start this kind of air travel going from A to B. I didn't have any support for getting the stuff typed. I'm still a terrible typist. So anything I did, I usually paid for myself. And by the, really, I had a couple of back and forth years after 79 with CMR in Quebec, but I had a little typing assistance. Basically, that was it. So there was no other. It was just me, and the CMCC went down the drain because its financing model didn't really work to support a national Muslim organization, and so there was really nothing. So whatever I did was basically on my own.
Wow. So the grant was a government grant?
Yeah, it was either Canada Council or something like that.
Okay.
Which or NSERC, whatever, one of those kind of things. And it was just to do this travel. There was nothing else to it.
Okay.
It was just I did some travel, so I got to some of the Western provinces, and I know down to Nova Scotia. But again, everything got lost, so that I have no paperwork, everything went up in the fire. But it was really very limited. So it's basically a one-man band here.
So can you do? I was about to talk about the fire. Actually, do you want to quickly mention for those folks that don't know what happened to the materials?
Without getting into the nasty details of it, an arsonist burnt our house down in 2011. Totally irrelevant to the thing, except that it killed. I mean, it wasn't to do, I don't think, not to do with being a Muslim. It's just a totally bad story. But it destroyed all the papers, the computer, the notes that I have, and these are all reel-to-reel tapes, or whatever you call it, you know, tape cassettes, masses of them. And I had interviewed a lot of people across the country that I did, with the idea back then that this would be a kind of history of, or a kind of social look at the Muslims of, say, the 1980s, you know, where they came from and who they were and what they were doing and why. And so after the fire, 2011, when my son-in-law pulled out of cyberspace somehow, what I had actually typed into the machine, then I said, gee, I have got a lot of stories of people that I knew or had interviewed, certainly, and that were actually alive, but they were in many cases already dead. So there were stories of people who were either living and dead, but in fact, a long way back, then already 35 years before, roughly. So it occurred to me, obviously, as a historian, that what do we need except a history, right? So then I started doing this history of pioneer Muslims, which I included myself because I was, in fact, a pioneer, as the book explains. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, yes, Murray, thank you. So as an archivist myself, I really enjoyed this book, and I'm especially fascinated with how you came to do this book and the reasoning why you made the book. And like you mentioned, there's just a lack of these histories of certain histories of Muslims in Canada. There is histories of what I think you mentioned, Lithuanians or Arabs and all this kind of stuff, ethnic groups. And there's also a lot of Canadian Christian history as well, because of different Christian archives, different churches that house Christian archives. So there's a lot of like Christian history here as well. So in terms of religion, there was nothing in relation to Muslims that existed. I'm wondering if you ever consulted any records, or did those help in any way at all in maybe finding people or anything like that?
No, I didn't. I mean, in that it wasn't, or it isn't, a kind of an academic study. I mean, I didn't spend years in archives digging through stuff like I'd already done my PhD. You know, I'd done with records for what it did me. So basically, what I did was that I, through personal contacts, or I would ask people, and I would go from one person to another and look up things, and occasionally I would find things on you know, the Wikipedia kind of thing. It would give me a reference, but I just worked my way through and across the country, picking up more people. And I would talk to somebody and said, "Oh yeah, there's some old man here, or you know, you should talk to that." And that's the way I did it. So it wasn't the kind of it wasn't the kind of PhD that you or any other sensible person would do. It was something else.
It was an oral history project, and that makes sense. That so a lot of the folks that are in the book, you know, in some way, at some point in your life, or maybe you know somebody that they know, or what, or there's some sort of word of mouth.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So,
and I've made I made a kind of family. I mean, there are people that I've never yet met, but some of whom I think are on this call, but who are kind of family. I mean, who I feel for, and we exchange messages, and it was quite a process. So I've got this kind of family of scattered Muslim pioneers or their descendants across the country. It's kind of interesting.
And I just want to highlight how huge a feat that is for you to have to connect to all these people and just go across the country physically. A lot of times you physically went to all these places, all these different people, and spoke to many of them.
Yeah.
And I think instead of, like you mentioned, staying sitting in an archival reading room and going through records and whatnot. I just want to I haven't mentioned this before to you already, Murray, but that's a huge feat, and thank you for that work.
I am honored. It's my privilege. But as you say, I went to visit. I mean, I would stay with somebody. We didn't have a budget for this, so I would stay with somebody in Vancouver and Edmonton and like.
Oh, you would stay in those.
Yeah, I mean that was
homes
it.
After you.
I remember being somebody's home during Ramadan in whatever it was, 1979 in Winnipeg, and things being brought out, and we had this great sort of iftar meal, etc. You know, that kind of thing.
I see what you mean. How they're for your family then. If you're breaking bread with
them. So it is family. I mean, it's
yes. So I was wondering then if we can move on and talk about some of the stories that are in the book then, if you don't mind, like moving across the country and from the west to the east, and picking out some of the stories and the people that you spoke to, and maybe also mentioning how you were connected to them personally.
Well, I mean, I've tabbed, starting. I mean, one of my favorite people is this woman, Hilwy Hamden of Edmonton, who was this driving force in getting that first mosque in Canada built in Edmonton in 1938. But she had come out. She'd been born, 1904 or something, and she'd been married at the age of, I guess, 16 or 17 to this pioneer Ali Hamdan, who was already up north, 4th Chipewyan and so on, and up in the Northwest Territories. So we have one of these Syrian Lebanese who had gone out decades earlier, made a sufficient fortune, then as a mature sort of settled man would then go back to the homeland, in this case, Lebanon, and particularly the Bekaa Valley, and marry some suitable relative and bring her back to North America, to some really obscure spot. So
I actually have a photo of them. I just wanted to share. Can you see the? Yeah, you can see the photo.
Yeah, there she is. Yeah.
Okay, that's Hilary.
So that typifies. I mean, I had to. I forget where I got that. Oh, I think I got that from Richard Howard. But I was always looking for pictures that would kind of typify the early people. I mean, the kind of vintage pictures, and this really does it for me. Yes. But let me just read you this little paragraph here.
What page is that on?
This is actually page 37.
If anybody has the book with them.
We're going to do a combined reading here. And Hilwy, who was this smart, young, brave woman, I was always very strict about my religion. There was a Catholic mission in Fort Chipewyan, and one of the priests said it was a shame that I should go to hell, the fire of hell, because I wasn't Catholic. And he still liked me very much, but he said it was too late for my husband. I asked him if the key to heaven was in the Catholic's hands, and he said to me it was. I told him I was very sorry, and that I was brought up in a strong religious family, and I thought heaven was open to everyone who is good, no matter what religion they are. I could never accept any religion except Islam. The other priest of the mission told me to never mind. He liked me as I was. He said I was a beautiful person and I should go to heaven in spite of everything. And she said then the next line was that I was in Canada for 5 years before I saw a Muslim woman. I mean, imagine, talk about isolation. These people, these pioneers, really had a grimmish, hard time. So, and she was remarkable, and she went on then to, I guess I should continue this this theme here, because she is just a remarkable woman.
Yes, you mentioned that she was part of the creation of the mosque.
Yeah, that's, I mean, if I can read this to you, she said that there was a thing formed apparently in 1934 out in Edmonton called the Arabian Muslim Association. And so she said that about this mosque building process, she said that Sheikh Najib had moved there to Edmonton from Winnipeg because there wasn't much Islam there. And he wanted to build a mosque. Now, I don't know who he was right now, I must admit. But he was alone. I attended the meeting and 3 people wanted a mosque and the rest wanted a hall. Now, she mentioned earlier, I think there were 22 Muslims in Edmonton at the time.
This was in the 1930s.
1937.
Right? Yes, yes.
And I attended the meeting, and there were 3 people, and the rest wanted a hall. I told them if it was a hall they wanted, they could use my house anytime for parties. Our home was always open. And needless to say, her husband was, Ali Hamdan, was a big, relative financial success. Our president said we were lost, but I told him, no, God is with us. I spoke up and told them that I was the youngest there and I was so hungry to hear the words of Allah. I told them we've got to know our religion ourselves, to believe in it and to know it, and we've got to teach our children. The motion to build a mosque was carried and passed the second time. The president was not convinced the mosque would be built, but I told him that if God wanted us to build the mosque, he would give us a helping hand. I saw the mayor, a man, John Fry, about purchasing a lot for the mosque. There were 2 lots, etc. And the people just opened their doors to her. She just was a driving force. I mean, just an amazing woman. And I did meet her, but to say it's 40 years ago.
Really?
Just a really remarkable woman. And apparently the other Lebanese Syrian women didn't really like her in some ways because she could get their husbands to do things. She said, Ali, go and do something and drive me to Saskatoon. They would drive and their wives thought, this little fancy whoever to pull this off.
No, I remember you mentioning that being mentioned that in the book that the other woman that didn't like her because of her strong personality, and I found that so interesting. But she was the driving force to create the Al-Rashid Mosque in Edmonton. I do have a photo of it.
Yes, there is. I'll hold. There it is.
There it is. There
that's
it is.
Yeah. That's, and you see, there's very little around it in those early days. I mean, that's one of its sort of second, what do you call it, transformation. It was built by a Ukrainian who could only build churches. I mean, what did he know about building a mosque? And what did they know? I mean, they were, Lebanese peddlers and so on. But anyway, they managed to get one dome on, and then and a minaret kind of thing. And then they did a little more repairs a few years later, and then they put the second one up, which gave it this kind of nice balance of 2 minarets. But it was still relatively out in open space on the edge of town there. Got a vacant lot from the mayor for not much,
Yes, I remember. I think
she was a convincing woman. She was a convincing woman,
I lost the page that I was going to mention, but there was something. Oh yeah, there was a interesting point here in the book and on page 40 where I think the book goes on about how remarkable she was, and the last comment about her being an accomplished bridge player, and I love the I love the little add-on about her being a bridge player as well. I wonder if we can go on to another wonderful.
This is Salim Ghanem, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Salim Ghanem, he was interesting. I mean, I'll just chatter away in case, unless you think of anything else.
No, of course. I'm going to find a photo as you chatter.
Yeah, he was born literally in a sod hut out in the prairies, out in Saskatchewan. I mean, it was literally a sod hut, and his father had come over the end of the 19th century, and about 1901 or so, he was pedaling with his horse and cart, probably by that time, out in North Dakota, I think it is. And he went to a farm, and he somehow struck up a connection with a woman, Chelsea Pritchard, who was very strong Methodist, I think the family was. And anyway, she came away with him, and they moved up to Canada. And she became a very keen Muslim. But Salim was this tall, lanky, interesting guy with very, very little chances in some way. I mean, he used to tell me about, riding, and we spent his whole youth as a riding, herding sheep and cows and so on out on the prairie. I mean, but anyway, he in terms of his learning, his religion and so on, I just thought this was really kind of interesting. So we didn't say prayers as such. Dad had a bath, which was usually once a week on the farm because it was cold in the winter. Every time he had his bath, he would always go to the bedroom and make his prayers. And I used to watch him. I was a little guy, you see, no time when we taught what to do. In the early days, around 1914, 1915, these prairie fires developed, and they ranged all over the area, covering 10 or 15 miles. And we know about fires in these days. In one particular incident, a prairie fire was coming, and there was a Kazil farm, which was another Arab Lebanese, because some people did go into farming, as his father did in between peddling and so on. And then there was our farm. Dad saw the smoke coming, and the farmers were hitching up their breaker plows to make 4 or 5 furrows to break the spread of the fire. Everyone was very concerned, and a Norwegian neighbor to the south of Kazils came over and said to Dad, "What's the matter? Everybody's fighting the fire, and you're not fighting the fire. You're not preparing for it." "No problem," Dad said. I think he used those words, maybe. He was not concerned at all. The fire was within range. Then he went up in a little haystack and offered his prayers, and the wind turned and the fire's out. I wasn't old enough to remember the actual fire, but I've been told this by the Kazil family themselves. You see, our family is descended directly from Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, the Persian Sufi saint of the 11th century Baghdad, and we belong to the Qadiriya sect. I mean, I think that's kind of interesting, getting this stuff all over here in the middle of Saskatchewan. When I was going to school in those years, the teacher would probably teach 1 year, and the second year there would be a new teacher. In the country, nobody wanted to stay too long. At this particular time, the new teacher came, and she wanted to know all about her students. Your name and your name, she asked. When it came to me, I answered Salim. Salim, oh, that's an odd name. What's your nationality? Syrian, I answered. She said, what's your religion? At that time, we didn't say Islam, we said Mohammedan, because that was the common term used, and I didn't know any better. She didn't ask any of the other students this question. Today, of course, I wouldn't have said Mohammedan. All of a sudden, she looked frightened. She took her hand and drew her finger across her throat and said, Turk. And she said that, and as she said that, her face reddened, and the boy was sitting next on one side of me and a girl on the other side, both got up and moved out of their seats, moved away quickly. I often think of that today and the changes that have taken place. At that time, they were so frightened of the Ottoman Empire that anything that referred to the Turks was frightening. And they became frightened of me. It took some time before my chums in the school would come back and sit beside me. To them, I was one of those wild Turks at any moment would draw a scimitar from my pocket or someplace and slice their throats. What a change it is between then and now. I mean, I just think that's kind of an interesting story. I mean, that experience. Imagine the kid.
Yes, and that's, I think he mentioned that's in 1914, 1915.
Yeah, and you can see him on the left, yeah.
Yes,
I mean,
he's on the
war,
left here.
all the Turkish, the Bulgarian war, all these Ottoman horrors and so on. But there he is on the left with his sister that we talk about later, and King Ganem, the famous fiddler of Canadian
That's his
television.
Brother.
Yeah, on the right of the picture, yeah.
Yes. So it is really interesting that in 1914, 1915, when there was war going on the other side of the world, we have Salim here, like you mentioned, in the prairies, talking about being related to a Persian Sufi saint, and then unfortunately also experiencing an Islamophobic.
In effect, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And it's an Islamophobe essentially who was afraid of him because. And how old was he? He was he was a child.
Well, I mean, he must have been in the first couple of grades. If he's born in 1910, and maybe he's in grade 2, 3, 4, something like that. He must have been under 10 years old.
Yeah, that's so unfortunate.
And that's kind of a burden. I mean, imagine the kid. I've been choked up before sometimes thinking about his situation. Anyway,
as a child experiencing that's. Sorry, I just needed a drink of water. I think, and so that was Edmonton, the Alberta area. I wonder if we can go into move to Swift Current, Saskatchewan next. We've hit some of the western part of the prairies. If we can hit Saskatchewan for the Hattums, who are very interesting.
Yeah, and again, I found him. I'm trying to think how I found. Muhammad,
oh right, Salim. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I just how I got Muhammad Hatem.
Oh, the Hattums, yes.
I can't quite think, but the little appropriate. I mean, not a little bit. I'll try to get through it quickly, but Muhammad Hatem was born in the 1950s in Saskatchewan near Swift Current. His grandfather had come out. So the late 19th century, his grandfather had come out, and his father in turn was born about 1925. And was that Muhammad himself.
Ali?
Yeah, first one was Ali, or Alex as he became.
Alex. Oh, I have a photo of him. Just one moment. Yes.
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 And again, he would by this time be an established, well-to-do man,
This is the grandfather, correct?
This is
the grandfather of Muhammad.
Yeah.
And he came, just trying to remember.
Late the last year or so of the 19th century, I think.
Wow.
And it came up from the States, I think, too, because they had gone farmed. I mean, people came into Canada from the States sometimes. But here, I mean, just like Saeed Ghanem, Salim Ghanem's father, they kind of came in from the Western States into Canada, where there was land was cheaper or something like that.
Yeah, so they were enticed by a lot of the land they were selling land in Canada and the prairies. Yeah, they were enticed by the prices there, and yes, and the immigration. I think it was mentioned a couple of times by some of the folks that you interviewed, but to immigrate, I think you just needed to work a year, do hard labor for a year, and then.
And so people basically went into doing whatever they needed to do to survive. But it seems even some of them just arrived off the boat, would go to some wholesaler. Right. How they find, I mean, imagine, these kids, they are kids. These people are arriving when you worry about the kind of unaccompanied
minors,
children at the American or the Mexican border. Think of the number of these people, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, often arriving by themselves. Now, they would know that across this vast continent somewhere, without benefit of internet or telephones, there would be some relative, but they would somehow make their way across the country with a bag of goods that would peddle along the way, or they would farm, or they would work here and there. Just amazing pioneer struggles. I found them just inspiring, the kind of thing these people did.
And is it ever mentioned where they get these goods from? Because I know a lot of the interviewees, they would mention that their father or their grandfather arrived. There's a mystery man in between who gave them goods, and then they would peddle them.
Yeah, well, that's I said that there were kind of wholesalers somewhere or other. Right. Some of them were Jewish, some of them were others, and they would be these people would these young people would somehow arrive without benefit of the language.
Right.
I don't know how they did it, but they got there, and they would then get a pack full of stuff, and they would go off on the country roads. They didn't seem to need a year of work in those days, it seems. You just kind of arrived, and if you could do anything, and they figured you'd be going into farming or something. And they may have said, farm, yes, I have no idea. Right. But some of them did. But they, and that's Alex's wife, or Ali's wife, right?
That's Alex's wife, yes.
Yeah, Karia. I love the necklace and so on.
The necklace, yes.
Again, I was looking for photographs that would capture that kind of, homeland kind of experience, what these people looked like when they came. But if I can read you just a little bit about his story.
Alex's?
This is Muhammad Hatem.
Oh, Muhammad Hatem, yes.
Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, he said that their parents taught their children, but there was not very much. And so some of the Muslims became Christians, and the parents didn't know very much. It seemed to be kind of
Very
stories
much.
and
Sorry, Murray. What do you mean they didn't know very much of what?
I mean, they didn't have very much Islamic training.
Oh, okay.
They might have been able to, recite verses by rote and that kind of thing, but they didn't have the kind of background you need to be able to pass on or explain Islam to anybody else.
Right.
So he said they experienced some racism. He said, I faced that, and this is his son Muhammad Hatem.
Do you have a page number, Murray? Sorry to cut you off again.
Sorry?
Do you have a page number?
I am on page 78,
Okay,
78, 79. Yeah, he said that I faced some of discrimination when I went to school. It was difficult, especially for my sister and me. Now, this is the Swift Current, or outside. We didn't know a word of English, and the school happened to be in a convent. The nuns would teach us, and they hired others as teachers. We took grade 1, 2, 3 in there. The English wasn't hard to learn. We learned that quick. But the religious festivals and stuff like that, we had to stay away from. And we were looked upon as outsiders. And he laughed at the time. One of the nuns told my sister something about Jesus Christ. And my sister said, we don't believe in Jesus Christ. Well, the nun, took her over her knee and paddled her because we weren't supposed to say that. After a couple of years, they understood about Islam, and our parents talked to the teachers and got through to them that we were not Christians. It was traumatic, oh yeah. But after we got older, it didn't bother us anymore. But it obviously must have been going on for a while. Of course. But when you're a kid, it's different, I'll tell you. You get worried. My sister was a year older than I was, and she went through everything before I did. We did the Quran, we read the Quran, we did the fasting, but the regular prayers, our parents never did teach us that. But when we got to the mosque, when we got the masjid in 1982 in Swift Current, then we learned all about it, how to do it. But growing up, there was no association here. There was nothing. We formed an association probably in 1980, 81, and we bought a mosque in 1982, the former Church of God. Muhammad Afsar, who I may be watching, who arrived in Swift Current in 1980. He was a Pakistani municipal engineer, a very knowledgeable man. Was the one who set up the association and everything. He did all the letter writing to foreign countries for money. He was an engineer, worked here, and felt there was a need for a mosque. He got people together and made an association and had a board of directors, and I've been on it ever since. Nobody else wants the job. But Muhammad Afsar, again, and as a pioneer, remarkable man. He deserves a great deal of credit.
And you said he might be here today. That's amazing. Thank you for joining us. Sorry, I was just flipping through the book, but
have we lost our place?
I was just trying to find the page that you were on, and I lost it, but it's okay.
Yeah. I think you mentioned you thought that London might be interesting.
Yes, I think London would be interesting. I know we are skipping. We're skipping a whole province in Manitoba, but for those of you, for those of you who are again, for those of you who are interested in more stories, because they're just a few that we're picking out today, please get the book and read more about Manitoba's wonderful community as well. But if we can go over to London, I guess this discussion is a bit biased to what I am interested in and what I'd like to hear. But I encourage those of you who do want to read more and learn more to get the book and read the rest of the stories as well. So if we can go to London.
Well, just a minute. There's a lot. I only got 2 people there. I mean, the chapters
in Manitoba.
Yeah, the chapters are different. I mean, it's sometimes base a chapter on only one pioneer, but I get a serious leading figure, and if you get the leading figure, then you've basically got the story. In the case of London, I got Hani Hassan and his wife Najat. Um,
I have a photo that you really like.
yeah, I mean, Hani I've known forever in Muslim groups, and this is them being married about 61 or something like that. He was
1962 here.
62.
Mhm.
Didn't promise you a wonderful memory there. But I mean, here they were. They were both Lebanese, but she came from a Shia family from, was it Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and then they moved to Toledo, Ohio. And she tells wonderful stories about growing up as a Muslim girl in this very tight community, and the encouragement of by her mother to get an education and all that kind of thing. And Hani, who was I guess the eldest of his family, but he became a kind of leader, and they both met through a thing called the Islamic Youth Association, which was an offshoot of the Federation of Islamic Associations of the United States and Canada, which started working in the 1950s. And they met at this thing, and obviously it worked. And then they decided to get married, and they were very active ever since, kind of thing. But their stories, which are very long and detailed, but do tell the whole story of the development of the Muslim community in London and all the kind of relations and how they did. It gives you a picture of how people arrived and what they did to make a living and how they eventually got a mosque and all the rest of it. I think they're both remarkable people, and still good friends, even after this. So yeah, that's the kind of London story, but it is a lengthy one, very detailed.
Yes.
Because of their kind of great recall of things.
And I think a comment I made in one of my sticky notes here was that London seemed to be just because of their great concentration.
Big center, yeah.
Yes, a big concentration of Muslims there, and also specifically of like Lebanese, the Syria Lebanese descent.
Yeah.
A lot of folks, this might be a spoiler in the book, but a lot of folks from different parts of Canada eventually moved to London because of the larger.
Because it was a magnet, it kind of drew people there. I mean, and there are a number of stories that turn up, and they would end up going to London because of the
and settling and staying there.
The majority. And it had the second mosque in the country built in 1957. So it was a kind of
yes, I have a photo of that too.
Yeah.
The second mosque in the entire country.
Yeah. And I have to tell you, we went to a wedding of some of the people mentioned who aren't discussed in our kind of plan here. But we went, it must have been about 1960, and we must have rented a car. And again, there were handfuls. I mean, the imam was a Shia imam who had to come all the way from Detroit, Imam Vebi Ismail, a wonderful man.
Yes.
But he came all the way from Detroit. He wasn't going to go all the way to Toronto, where this couple was coming from. But we kind of met up in London, and this must have been in this very early mosque, which was just put up in 57. It was a big house. So that's where the wedding must have been, and we all squeezed into this car. Yeah, that's the place. I'm sorry the picture's not better, but just murder getting the right one. But anyway.
This is the house where the London mosque was.
Future historians will be able to get better pictures than I was, but when you got a big budget and a graduate student's grant or something, you may be able to do it.
So I think I have a photo. So after that, and in 1964, they made a new building.
They made a more purpose-built Muslim center or Islamic center, and that's the one you saw outside, of which the crowd was gathered when they were commemorating the death of the family in London earlier this year. I mean, it was on the steps of that mosque that those pictures were being taken of that crowd outside.
So so in 1964, they built a purposeful building, and it still exists. Yes, so this still exists today, and that's the one where yes, okay. I think that I have also a photo of I know this is a little bit off our schedule, but I have also a photo of Hani's mom, which I remember
Yes.
you liked.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, if you can find that one. Yeah, there are two pictures I took. That's great.
let me see if I can.
I
Here
should
it
mention
is.
just while you're looking for that,
Yes.
Najat Hassan's father came over from Lebanon in 1914 or something like that in those years of the First World War and joined the American Army. It was probably a good way of getting into the country. And he went off and was a soldier in the First World War and he became an American. Now that's his mother. The first one. This is this very fine lady in the black dress. You have to see the first picture before that, which is of
yes.
their wedding. Again, probably staged like wedding pictures often are, but I just think it's neat the contrast between this very fashionable looking lady and this one. Here's the wedding picture. All these things are probably very traditional, the jug and the clothes and everything, very Lebanese. And then in the next picture, when she's still in after the wedding, here she is in this black dress, marrying this much older, successful businessman.
I think, okay, so we have a couple more stories that we need to get through before I have some questions for you, Murray. Can we go to the Hamilton and Niagara region?
Yeah.
I think you wanted to talk just to quickly mention
the kind of atmosphere, I think, of this Muhammad Baba.
Yes.
He came again. It was a South African who came over, an Indian from South Africa came over.
Very interesting story, yes.
And eventually went into government immigration work successfully. But he was looking back at the 60s and when we all first started. I mean, the Islamic Society of Kingston had just been born in the late 1950s, Muslim Society of Toronto rather, and we've got our little mosque in 60 or 61. It was just a shop front place, but there were so few of us. I mean, but he said what was beautiful about those days in the 60s and 70s with the mosque in Toronto and the community in Hamilton, that's where he did a lot of his work teaching Islamic school and so on, was that while the community was small, it was very diverse and we accepted everybody. In Hamilton, we had a Shia family of Boras, the fivers instead of the 12ers, and they would attend our Islamic school and they would attend the mosque. Nothing was made of it. We knew they were Shia and it was accepted, just like in Toronto, where there was a Shia school teacher teaching at Toronto's first mosque on the weekend. He was a top man from Iraq. He couldn't go to Iraq at the time under Saddam Hussein, but after Saddam, he went back to Iraq and became a member of the government. He was Hussein Shahrastani, and I remember him because we were this tiny community sitting in our little shopfront Islamic center in Toronto. So that was the kind of society we had, and it's captured in the TV series, The Little Mosque on the Prairie. And that's the kind of mosque we had in Hamilton and Toronto. And that was the kind of mosque we lost when the Muslim Brotherhood inspired people came in, like in Hamilton at the university. We had lots of trouble with them. They were very extreme and they influenced some of the community members also, and that became really bad. I know I attended meetings where people were saying what ISIS is saying now, and I couldn't believe it. The thing to learn from all this is that while we have grown in numbers, we have divided up into different ethnic groups, and we have become very doctrinaire in our beliefs and rituals, and we are less willing to accept differences. The other point, in conjunction with what you mentioned in terms of the future, I was asking questions, is that there is hope for the future in our youth, because the youth are Canadian and they're getting away from the sectarianism of their parents. It will take a while, but I think there is going to be a difference there. I see it in my children's friends, and I see it with the newer generations that are coming up. That's the hope. So that was Muhammad Baba's, again, another remarkable man, again, a friend. But it was this kind of thing, and then it tragically broke apart, and we'll maybe talk about that later.
Yeah, I think I was going to mention, since you mentioned it all, well, since you mentioned it through Muhammad Baba already, I was going to ask you about this this division that you know, that he mentions here. Well, the lack of division, I guess, that he mentions here in the book.
Yeah.
The Sunni Shia differences,
Yeah.
and he makes a point of saying that too. So I guess I'm wondering what kind of divides existed in the community at the time, and
Well,
and sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, there some. I have somebody else who speaks rather well about that. But
Yeah,
when you have a group that, I mean, we were all just a mixture of people, and we're not in very large numbers, so nobody's way kind of, and we were all just kind of learning our way. None of us had run an Islamic organization before, and we were just a scattering of early immigrants or people like myself, you know, who were born here. So you had no great vested background interest, but when you got more of one nationality or another, then they tended to want to impose that on others and say, no, this is the way to do it, and you're wrong in doing it that way. And that comes up tragically in a number of cases. So there was a divide in the Muslim Society of Toronto, which was this first little group, which was basically Albanians, to which we outsiders kind of added ourselves.
Oh, okay. Can we move on to the Muslim?
Yeah, and so you get all these kinds of
Mhm.
frictions come up. Different groups started teaching things differently or wanting to be more orthodox or super orthodox, etc. Okay.
Oh, can we then, since you mentioned them, can we go on to the Albanian Muslim community in Toronto? I think they're very interesting,
Yeah.
and especially the Muslim Society of Toronto. I have a photo here of, I think, the person that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, that's Fatima Karim and her husband, Sami Karim, who married in the 50s, I guess it was. It must be early 50s. And she was the first, one of the very first people I met, even before Alia could come to Canada, when I was in Toronto looking around for Muslims. And she was about the second person I met after Sayyid Bukhari, who I met in the TV studio. Let me see if we can find it.
Well,
yeah, you're
but I
skipping.
did.
Yeah, you'd like to hear the bit about Fatima Karim, her.
Yes, the Fatima Karim, and especially how the Albanian Muslim community in Toronto essentially started what became the Muslim Society of Toronto.
Yeah, well, the Albanians, interestingly, were, as they've admitted themselves, they were more nationalist than religious, were Islamic. But they did have their leader, who they called Imam, his name was Recep Asam, and he was a little quiet man, but quite studious and knew about Islam. But they had come to Canada around the time of the First World War. And then you had to, if you're going to start a business or get any money, you had to be able to say, or get a job, you had to have what's your religion, you had to get a letter from your minister and so on. Of course, Muslims, it was difficult getting letters from their ministers to get a job, you know. So they, like the Jews, went into business for themselves. So they started making candy and that kind of thing. And they had and there he is. And he was this quiet, sweet little man, but he always would pull out extra money to keep our little pot going when we had this little building. And so very astute, interesting man, but very quiet. But he was their imam. So he buried them and married them if they or the children married and so on. Remarkable man. And he died basically of a broken heart because the things went bad again in the 1970s in Toronto. And he was up trying to clear out some pigeons from this church that we had bought, and fell off a ladder and died. But
is that the Bosted Church?
Pardon? Yeah, that's the Bosted Avenue Church. Yeah, which they called the Jami Mosque.
The Jami Mosque, right? Yeah, I do remember specifically in the Muslim, in the Toronto area, there was a lot of different divides that happened at different times.
Yeah.
So, but it was essentially, is it fair to say essentially that it was the Albanian community that may have like kind of united the Muslim community?
Well, their role is that they were there, but they realized that people like ourselves were coming in and saying, well, let's get together. What are we going to do? And so because they all were shop owners and shoe shine, they had shoe shops, and one had a nightclub and all sorts of different things. So they provided the money for us more active people who wanted to actually be able to say our prayers somewhere.
I see.
These people didn't really. And there's reference, one of the people saying, it was a pity there was a funeral, but nobody among the Albanians could actually do anything about it. So it took the Indo-Pakistanis and occasional Egyptians and so on, people like ourselves, who then were able to do these things. So they kind of bankrolled this early community and continued to do so, but they had this kind of tragic history that everything went from crazier to crazier with kind of MSA and other activities and the Tabligh Jamaat and so on. So they got driven off and they went and formed their own little group again. I mean, they took the money and started their own little thing in another building on Annette Street in Toronto.
Murray, we are a little bit short on time, so I wonder if we can. Would you like to go into Quebec, or actually, I'm wondering if you could speak to this photograph that I really liked, and I think you can personally actually speak to.
Oh. The famous picture. Well, this is myself on the left with this mustache standing next to Malcolm X. And I framed, the story in brief is that it must have been January of 1965, Malcolm X had become a kind of an Orthodox Muslim, in the summer of 1964, and broke up with the Nation of Islam of Elijah Muhammad, and sort of saw the light, as it were, and became a kind of Orthodox Muslim, as opposed to this kind of basically racially motivated so-called Nation of Islam, which wasn't really very Islamic. But anyway, so I met him at a studio in the CBC, and somebody tipped me off, a big secret that he was coming to be a mystery guest on Front Page Challenge. So I went to him in the kind of breathing space in between, and I said, I'm Secretary of the Muslim Society of Toronto. Are you staying here, or are you going to come back? And if so, would you come and talk to our group? And he said, yes, he would. And he then came back. It kind of only been weeks later. I have no records of this, the trouble was. But he came back, and so I picked him up. He had come to see Austin Clarke, a West Indian activist, and moved to, anyway, he was coming to see Austin Clarke. So I picked him up from Austin Clarke, took him home. Alia made him a nice dinner, and we had a few friends, and we sat around with sort of food in our lap, because there were more of us, and we had a dining table for. And then we hustled him into a car. I guess I drove him out to this Islamic center. You can see our little painting on the back. I mean, that's all we could make, So I designed these little
Where was this, the center?
Well, this is 3047 Dundas Street West in Toronto.
Right.
Which was, to say, a leather workers thing with an apartment upstairs, a little house. And anyway, so then he spoke, and he said, what do you want me to speak about? And I said, well, we don't need to hear about the black man's struggles and, America, because we're Muslims, we're already with you in a sense. We're already convinced. So tell us about the Hajj and so on. And so he did. And then I had framed up this little inscription that we got somewhere. That was all we could give him, we didn't have money or anything. And so this is a bunch of us standing around. And then he was bustled into a car, went out to what was then Malton Airport, which is now Toronto International, etc. And within weeks, he was dead. So I don't know why it does this. Anyway, he died, and the police, I think, raided our place before, I think, checking out, because they didn't know who Malcolm X was. They thought he was the Nation of Islam and a threat to the CIA or the FBI, etc. So it was an interesting experience, but I have no record. We didn't have tape recorders. Nobody took notes. And just like the dinner, I mean, said, what did he say? Well, we just talked. We were Muslims. We were friends having supper. You know, there was that kind of relationship. We knew he was a marked man, and he said he couldn't get insurance. And Alia said, well, having 4 daughters was a blessing because the Prophet had daughters, etc. But it was that very kind of low key kind of thing.
Yeah.
But then suddenly he kind of really blew into the front pages, you know, at least in Canada, certainly, because he was dead, and of course in the States, but he's now being remembered. I mean, his work that he was, you see, he was just starting to switch over from this kind of Nation of Islam, kind of racist, basically a racist organization, to this international working with people, people of goodwill and so on, to try to build up a Muslim organization that will be able to stand up for people and represent them and make a better life for Blacks and others in the States. But he didn't get to do it. And then, of course, Martin Luther was also killed, and Martin Luther King, and all that string of early people went. But it was a remarkable experience. But I say, I'm you know, forever kicking myself for not having recorded or been able to record it, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, there he is.
Thank you for sharing that, Murray. I know it is difficult. I'm getting a warning that we have only a few minutes left for the next. I think we have a room for one more story, so you can choose which one you'd like to share. We have a couple left here, so I wonder if you want to go to Quebec or the East Coast.
Well, I'll just mention in 2 words each the tabs that I had. One, I was going to talk about the Ottawa Muslim Association, which finally got a mosque in 72. But the thing was that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was then the president or foreign minister, or whatever, prime minister of Pakistan, had come to this gathering in Ottawa and had said, oh, they said, we would like to build a mosque. And they said, oh, I'll give you $100,000, which is a lot of money then. But he had meant to say rupees, but anyway, then it came to the bit, and they said, you know, he wanted to give them 100,000 rupees, which was not going to be very much. But and Naeem Malik said, no, in the house of God, you said $100,000. We want $100,000. And so he coughed up this kind of thing. But anyway, they did get a mosque in Ottawa, which is the one with the dome, it's the kind of first one. Other people I was going to mention, well, just Mumtaz Rahman of Montreal, again, one of the founding people. They had trouble with the Tabligh Jamaat people who would come and camp and made, but here the important thing about him is not the troubles they had later, but here they are in 1965 going to Quebec City, where they got a special act passed recognizing Muslims as a people. I mean, they weren't they couldn't get married. You had to get married by a minister in Quebec until this thing came through in 1965. So
you had to get married in a church, even if you're a Muslim.
Yeah. So and then getting cemeteries has been a murder in Quebec, particularly the racism there. I mean, it's just amazing. It continues to today with their acts and so on, which are significantly anti-Muslim. But this is an important picture of them. That particular, this is a statue outside Quebec City, a bit outside the what is it, the National Assembly in Quebec. But I mean, they all had interesting different times. And the last thing, the one I just wanted to do, just like do that little bit about Murray Joseph in Truro, Nova Scotia.
Right. Yes.
That's where they put up the first cemetery in Canada in 1944. And this guy, whose name became Murray Joseph, because people couldn't deal with his father's name, he became Murray Joseph. And he said, he was talking about his family and so on, because his father had been the one who had first come. There were many stories about the peddlers. In those days, all peddlers were Turks. They were from the Ottoman Empire and on the side of the Khazar in the First World War. They had a reputation in Canada, and it was said that they would eat children. one time during winter, my father and his cousin were peddling and they knocked at a house and no one would let them in. They were freezing and my father decided he would have to do something. He knocked again, and when they answered, he said, "What's that building over there?" The man answered, "That's our church." My father took out a match and said, "I'm going to set it on fire." And the man said, "No, come in and have a cup of coffee. Stay, I want to talk to you." And so they came in and they stayed and the people fed and looked after them. And the next day they bought some of their items from them. And of course, my father had no intention of setting fire to the church. They just wanted to get in out of the cold. I mean, and they just had miserable times because of the, I won't go into the rest of it, but miserable times, you know, because of the language barrier, not understanding whether they're being offered food or not. And they often were just put to sleep in the winter in the snow on an open veranda, or just froze to death, sleeping by the side of the road kind of thing, or got beaten up and killed in some cases. So it's very difficult. Those early Lebanese Syrian peddlers particularly were real hard done by pioneers, but they really worked at it and they succeeded, which is the great thing.
Yes. Thank you for all those stories, Murray. There's a ton more, I promise you, in the book if you get a chance to read it. I think so. I don't have a lot of time for my questions, Murray. Though I can see that a few folks have asked the same questions that I was going to ask you. So I'm going to just transition into the Q&A portion because we have some questions. If I can ask the first one. The first one is, I'm just going to find it. Okay, by Ali, and I'm going to read it out for you, Murray. They say, "Salam, thank you for taking the time to discuss your work today, Murray. A couple of questions. First, could you please talk about people topics that you were not able to cover in your book that you would like to tackle in a future project or would encourage researchers to take up if you are not going to do them?"
Yes. Yes, the kind of people I would have loved to, there have been a number of women, and it is the problem, again, this is 1979, that you tended to want to find the head person at an Islamic organization, and it's usually going to be a man, right? There are relatively few cases. Now, I did interview other women, but they didn't get typed in many cases. But there are a bunch of women that I wish I had talked to. Hani Hassan's mother, for example, or Najat Hassan's mother, or Wayne Harris's mother down in Truro, Nova Scotia. I mean, remarkable people who carried on, ran stores, filled in when their husbands weren't there or after their husbands died. Then they would carry on the family business and do things like that. And they did all the preparation. And one of the women, Solmaz Shaheen, Dr. Shaheen's widow, said that it was because of the efforts of the women preparing the food, getting things ready, making the meals, inviting people, doing all that stuff, that their husbands, who were the kind of big names, then were able to do whatever they did for Islamic organizations and the cause of Islam. But it was the women who were back, and she said she didn't want to diminish it, but people had to remember that they did the donkey work to make these things, you know, to open their houses for Sunday schools or whatever.
And this was the person you mentioned, Solmaz Shaheen, was the wife of Dr. Fouad
Shaheen, yeah. He was a Turkish.
He was a pillar of the Niagara Muslim community.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you wanted to mention this, Maria, or not, but I really enjoyed the story of them, how their home essentially became Niagara's mosque, and where the Quran classes were, where prayers were held, everything, all those celebrations were all in their home.
Yeah. Actually, it was in Hassan and Nimit
and
Karachi's
Hassan
house, because they were first in Niagara Falls. Right. It was a remarkable Bosnian, and then he struggled with this getting this paint industry going, and but the family are still there. But then Fouad and Nimmat came in the mid '60s. But they're kind of really interesting stories about acceptance. I mean, if I can backtrack for a sec, with Fouad, when he arrived at Hotel Dieu Hospital in the 1950s here in Kingston, the nuns noticed he wasn't eating because it was still run by nuns in those days. And he said, oh, he's a Muslim, he didn't eat pork, etc. Well, they made him special meals. And then when it was fasting time, they said, why aren't you eating? And he said, well, I'm fasting. And they made special things of night and day, etc. They did all sorts of things for people in the early days. And so Islamophobia is very kind of up and down subject. There are good stories and bad stories. But he was a remarkable man and lived until the 90s. Really interesting. Again, an old friend. I went with him we shared a room in Iran in Tehran in 1980, and I'd always call him Effendi because of the Turkish background. But anyway, that's another story.
And that's a good point you make, that about the Islamophobia seen by the different individuals, and it's very evident in the interviews too. They do mention that they've had some good experiences, but also some bad experience at the time too. And a lot of it, I know, like for example, some of the folks just didn't know what Islam was. I think I think there was a mention of a teacher somewhere who just didn't know, or a librarian who just didn't know what Islam was, and others were just plainly Islamophobic, like with Salim Ghanem's story.
Yeah, can I interject one little story from Muhammad Afsar? When they arrived in Swift Current in 1980, when the Lebanese kind of farming community had not really got very far with anything. Until he arrived, and he and his wife Zia arrived to do all sorts of good stuff. But he said that a minister showed them around a church, and they might use some rooms for classes and getting things going. And the minister realized and said, and this he knew, he said, I know you people don't have pictures and so on in your mosque, and we have some crosses and pictures of Jesus and so on, and Mary. And so we're pleased to cover those over while you're using these premises and so on. And Muhammad Afsar said, if our faith was that weak that we were going to be bothered by that, then we couldn't be very good Muslims. I mean, it's just remarkable. And here was this minister, and he remarks on it. It's just remarkable that they were prepared to go out of their way to help these Muslims. So it has, as I say, it's up and down due to various outside influences in many cases.
So there are some, I think we have about a couple more questions, Murray, if we can. Please. We have only a few minutes left. The next question is from Zainab. So they ask, how did you find conversations with Malcolm X, his temperament, or the way he carried himself?
Well, in brief, as I mentioned, it was very friendly. I mean, there was no, I guess I'm a friendly kind of person, and I'm a Muslim, and I expect, equal kind of treatment. And so we just talked nicely. It was just no, he didn't have any kind of edge to him. He was not, the towering figure of the Denzel Washington scene in the movie and that kind of thing. He was just this nice man, and we talked about various things in the limited time we had. But that's why I feel bad about this, not having any record of it. Yes. But we were just being friendly people talking, conversation.
The next question we have is from Fauzia, and they have their hand raised. I wonder if you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Assalamu alaikum. Congratulations, Murray, on this significant and timely accomplishment. I look forward to purchasing my copy. And it sounds like you collected a lot of material. Is there enough for more from you? Is there any consideration of doing any sort of a documentary based on what you've researched? And I'm going to sneak in one more question. Out of everything that you've learned and remarked on, what was the most surprising thing for you?
Those are all, well, let me start with the beginning ones. I don't have more material really, because I was trying to work within this up to 1967 kind of thing. Now there are lots of more people I would be glad to go and interview, doing this kind of, and sometimes in some of these cases, I interviewed, say, their children, because they were close enough and tell the story far enough back to the turn of the century, the previous century, that is, but I don't think Noor Jahan would be up for doing another book. And but no, so I don't have plans. I mean, I am 86, so I don't have plans right now to tackle another book. I mean, it's you know, one thinks about this, but you can't necessarily do it. I don't know if anybody else is going to do documentaries or whatever, goodness knows. And what was the very last question?
What surprised you?
Oh, what surprised me? Nothing surprised me about Muslims. No, I can't say. I mean, what surprised me was their extraordinary, particularly the early ones, and even the later ones who came over in the 50s and 60s. I mean, the struggle these immigrants have to do because they are a somewhat discriminated against group associated with ISIS and, you know, Boko Haram and God knows what all bad things, the Taliban and the rest of it. So they have a very uphill work and a job ahead of them. And because of the difference in dress of some of them, you know, hijabs and so on, they have a very hard row ahead to, as somebody said in one of these things, you know, it's very hard being a Muslim these days. You can get acceptance from lots of people, but it depends on kind of class and education situation, and what's in the news and how crazy people are or not. You know, if they're going to run you over with a car, or they're going to want you to come and talk to their school class, you know, it varies.
I have a two-part question next, Murray. Sorry, did I cut you off or anything? Or were you going to add? Okay. So I have a question here from Aisha. Do you have any collection of pioneer Newfoundland Muslims in addition to the brief experience of Dr. Hamdani in St. John's? And how much of the oral histories have you been collecting since the late 1970s has been destroyed in the unfortunate fire, and are you considering to revisit the missing pieces in a second edition? I think you answered the second one.
Yeah, I think, and the first one, you mentioned Hamdani.
Yes.
I mean, the point about him, I mean, he was a big help, and I've talked to him and sent him manuscripts and chapters and sections until he died. But he's important, particularly. He was an economist, very noted, you know, federal government economist. But when he was asked in the 1970s to make a speech about Islam, he really didn't know very much, and especially about Muslims in Canada. So he started looking it up, and he was able to find in the 1871 census, and he asked other librarians to come and look at this again on the microfiche. But in fact, it said there were, you know, they worked out that there were 13 Mohammedans. They said, that's the word we're looking at. There they are. They are, in fact, there. And it had been coming since the 1850s. The first ones were recorded. So Muslims have been here since well before Confederation, and were, I say, 13 of them, you know, in the years following Confederation. And of course, the numbers went up, but they went up very slowly. As I say, for, you know, before and after the First World War, there were still less than 1,000 of them, maybe even 500. I mean, there are really not many Muslims here until the 1950s, and then after the 1960s, I mean, the Muslims weren't even counted as a group from 31 until 81, when the CMCC said, really, you know, we're here, we ought to be counted. And there were about 100,000 of them by then, or us. So, but no, I don't have any further plans right now. I'd be.
So does that mean you don't, do you have any more? I think the question was like, do you have any more material right now from your previous?
No, I mean,
it's all in the book. Everything went into the book. Okay. I see. Yeah. And when the fire. Okay, I see.
You can look at the footnotes though. The footnotes have got interesting stuff.
Yes. So we are out of time, unfortunately, and so I want to thank you again, Murray, so very much for your time, for Noor Jahan and Mohanzi House team for helping us put this together. I would not have had these photographs for everyone without you folks. Again, thank you so much, Murray, for this wonderful work that you've created. I hope everybody gets a chance to get the book. Actually, I have a
thank you for the opportunity, the honor of being here.
I have a link here that I was hoping to share. Where's my technology? Oh, oh, oopsie. Oh, here it is. Okay. Oh, this is not the right. If I go to the. All right, this is the book, and the website is on there, and as well, I hope in the chat as well. I can't see the chat right now, but please get the book. And again, thank you all for joining us. We have a couple of things that before we leave that I wanted to mention. Oh yes, this is how to contact me. And also the Lindsay House website is on there as well. And we want to thank you for joining again. And I also wanted to mention that we have an event in August 17th, on August 17th, where we're collaborating, it's called Archiving Silence, where we're collaborating with the Tamil Archive Project in Toronto to talk about archival underrepresentation in marginalized communities. So there is a website there for folks that want to join us for that event. This event has been recorded, so then we will be posting a link to the video on our YouTube channel. So look out for that as well. And I think those are all my final comments. If I'm forgetting anything, Zad or Emily, please let me know.
Can I say thank you to Nur Jahan
of course, please.
and MG Vasanji for taking this project on, and for the Institute for taking an interest in it. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Murray, for being so supportive of our work as well, and for being supportive of the Institute, of MiCA, and the project as well, and for the honor of being able to talk about this, have this book talk with you, and it's been a wonderful experience for me. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.